All right, so I'm sorry, I'm just now hitting record. I'll go back and review what we had already taken care of before the recording started. But let's look at the Cold War Oversimplified Part 1, and then we'll come back and talk about the other stuff that we had already talked about.
On the Eastern Front of the First World War, both Germany and Russia are on the brink of collapse. Soldier, I need you to bring me this man. Got it. Found him, sir. What? No, not Lenin. Lenin, the Russian communist. What? Why would I need a beetle? Lenin, the Russian communist. He was exiled to Switzerland. You know what? I'll do it myself. Who wants to start a revolution?
At Southeastern Oklahoma State University Online, we believe you will discover it's not how much you already know or don't, it's how determined you are to learn. If you're ready to earn your degree, we're here to support you every step of the way. Choose from 35 online programs in business, education, Native American leadership, and more. Pay as you go. Keep working. Study from anywhere. Plus, it's easy to apply.
The Germans put Lenin on a train and sent him all the way back to Russia, hoping he and his mates would create an internal crisis. And create an internal crisis they did. The government was overthrown, and Lenin was in charge. He immediately pulled out of the First World War, made the country communist, started a 3-year-long civil war, got shot, broke the economy, caused a famine, and then he died. On his deathbed he said, "Hey man, tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader. By the way, who did I put in charge of giving people jobs? That would be Stalin, sir." Stalin was a rising force in the Communist Party. He still had some opponents, but conveniently, all of them were arrested or disappeared. So that was lucky. And so Stalin took over. He implemented his 5-year plans, which transformed the country from an agriculture-based economy to an industrial one. And like Lenin before him, he reigned with terror. Anyone who dared criticize or oppose him would either be killed or left to rot in the horrendous Soviet work camps. Then a short man with a silly mustache tried to take over the world, punched the Russians all the way to Moscow, and then the Russians, with some help from their faithful ally, the Winter, punched them all the way back to Berlin. At this point, being allies, America, the UK, and the Soviet Union were good chums. They held a couple of conferences near the end of the war to decide what would happen next. Hey Stalin, after all your trials and tribulation, you must be pretty happy to be standing here in Berlin. Tsar Alexander made it all the way to Paris. Just give me a second. Hey man, I think something's up with Stalin. I know, right? What should we do? Shall I tell him about the bomb? Yeah, tell him about the bomb. That will scare him. So, we got this crazy new big A-bomb that can destroy an entire city in one go. Yes, my spies told me already. Oh wait, I meant to act surprised. Wow, that's amazing. He already knew. How? Am I sure I want to send nuclear secrets via unsecure public coffee shop Wi-Fi? Am I ever? Dude, use a VPN. And speaking of VPNs, if, like me, you take internet safety seriously, then you need NordVPN. NordVPN hides your online activities from outside intruders, preventing anyone from stealing your personal data and stopping your service providers selling your data to advertisers. With over 5,000 servers in 62 countries, it allows you to surf the net anonymously and securely. And it's simple to use. With just a click of a button, you can connect to a server halfway across the world, even allowing you to access streaming services from that specific territory. Say, for example, you wanted to watch a certain oversimplified video that for some reason has been blocked in your country. With NordVPN, you can. It works seamlessly across PC, mobile, and tablet. Go to nordvpn.com/oversimplified to get an amazing 75% off. That's just $2.99 per month, with an additional month free for a limited time. So again, that's nordvpn.com/oversimplified, also in the description box down below. Now where were we? Oh yeah. Does the A stand for atomic or ass? Then America dropped their big A-bomb on Japan, and World War II officially came to an end. Hooray, we won! Okay, so now it's time to establish the New World Order. Stalin, you're in charge of Eastern Europe. Now, we want you to let them all hold elections. Oh yes, of course, elections. And these elections will be free and fair, right? Oh yes, certainly, free and fair. Definitely free and fair. Communist, 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 communist. If that's not free and fair, I don't know what it is. Throughout Eastern Europe, Soviet puppet governments were established as a buffer zone between the USSR and the West, with Churchill proclaiming an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The relationship between the old allies was deteriorating fast. Over the next few years, the British intervened in the Greek Civil War to prevent a communist takeover. In Turkey, the Russians began demanding more control of Turkey's sea access routes, which prompted the US to send their largest battleship to Turkey for a friendly visit. After World War II, Iran was now occupied by both the Soviets and the British, with an agreement to both pull out once the war was over. The British pulled out. Stalin was like, you know what? I think I might stick around. All in favor of kicking Russia out of Iran? You want to know something? You guys suck. Pressure from the UN forced the Soviets to leave, and with the establishment of NATO, the Soviets had no doubt that the West was out to encircle and destroy them. And America announced the Truman Doctrine, in which they basically said, those guys are not cool, cannot be trusted, and we will do everything we can to prevent the spread of communism around the world. Many viewed this moment as the official declaration of the Cold War. Back in Europe, everyone was living in a post-apocalyptic void brought on by the Second World War. Cities reduced to rubble, not enough food. It was terrible. This is great. The more they suffered, the more likely it is they'll turn to communism. Dude, you're really messed up. What's wrong with you? My father used to punish me severely. America realized what was going on and quickly made a move. Under the Marshall Plan, they sent $12 billion to Western Europe for its economic recovery. The countries of Stalin's Eastern Bloc looked on with envy. Hey, Czechoslovakia, you want to come get some economic aid? Yeah, but I have to check with my mom first. Sorry, America. I can't come. This was a full-on economic battle raging between capitalism and communism in Europe. If the Western nations developed faster and better than the East, that would be a defeat for Stalin. So he set up his own rival economic recovery plan, which he called Comecon, and he also set up Common Form, which gave him more political control over the Eastern Bloc. But nowhere did this economic battle rage harder than in the city of Berlin. Caught over 100 miles behind Soviet lines, the city had been divided up between the Allies, and the western segments were still under Western control. East Berliners could travel freely to West Berlin, see the economic prosperity and think, maybe this communism thing ain't so great after all. I'm gonna have fun tonight. You're home late. Oh, Stalin. I was just out with my friends. Friends? You stink of capitalism! You're out engaging in imperialist debauchery again! I swear, Ivan, I can't keep doing this. Stalin wanted the West out, so he said, hey, guess what? I'm blockading all of your supply routes to West Berlin. What are you gonna do about it? I suppose we'll just fly the supplies in. All right, Truman. You win this round. The Berlin airlift was an incredible undertaking and a major success for the Western Allies, and Stalin ended his blockade of West Berlin. His aggressive actions worried the West, but not as much as this did. The Soviet Union had developed their very own atomic bomb. The USA no longer had a nuclear monopoly. The world now knew that if a major war broke out between the two superpowers, it would be more destructive than anyone could imagine. So it was comforting when Stalin came out and said that war between the Soviet Union and the West was unlikely. Oh, wait, inevitable. He said it was inevitable. Hey, you know who I haven't checked in on in a while? My good friend China. Whoa, what happened to you? What happened to them was a full-blown civil war that had been going on since 1927. The People's Liberation Army, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, successfully defeated the Republic of China, who fled to Taiwan. The now communist China and the Soviet Union signed a mutual defense treaty. This was terrible news for the West. But wait. There's more. After the Second World War, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. In the north, the Soviets set up a communist regime. In the south, America set up an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Korea under their own regime. Now that he had the bomb, Stalin was feeling a little more cocky, and he finally gave Kim permission to attack. The North launched a surprise invasion of the South on June 25, 1950. With Soviet aid, the North Koreans steamrolled through, taking Seoul in just 3 days and replacing one ruthless dictator with another. The UN were freaking out and quickly created an emergency force made up of troops from 16 countries to defend the South. The West still held Busan and made landings at Incheon near Seoul. They pushed the North Koreans out of Seoul, replacing the ruthless dictator that had replaced the first ruthless dictator with the same ruthless dictator that had previously been replaced by the new ruthless dictator. And the West then continued all the way up the Korean peninsula. At this point, China was getting worried that the UN may just keep going. The US had sent this guy to lead the operation. After winning the Pacific theater of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur's head was big and his balls were bigger. He reassured President Truman that there was absolutely no way at all that the Chinese would ever get involved. Meanwhile, 500,000 Chinese troops were crossing into Korea. Nuke 'em. No, nuke 'em. No. Ah, come on. You're fired. The US considered the nuclear option, but now that the Soviets also had the bomb, they didn't want to risk all-out global destruction. The communists pushed the West right back almost to the exact same spot they
Just so that you guys know, that idea that the fact that both the United States and the Soviet Union had those options, it's called MAD, or mutually assured destruction. It's the idea that if all enemies have the same level of weapons, nobody's actually going to push a button, because if one pushes a button, the other will push a button, and bye-bye globe. Okay?
had all started from, and they ended up in a stalemate, where they remained until both sides finally agreed to work towards a peace settlement in 2018. Back in America, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected famed World War II General Eisenhower, who is really hard to draw. It's 1953. Hey Stalin, how you doing? Oh, he's dead. He had a cerebral hemorrhage, and his reign of terror kinda came back to bite him in the ass, because he had imprisoned all of his best doctors, and those that were left were too terrified to treat him. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, called a meeting and said, "Hey guys, you know how Stalin was imprisoning and murdering us all for doing basically nothing? Yeah, he was kind of a jerk. I'm really not sure how this is news to you." Khrushchev went on a campaign of de-Stalinization. Statues of Stalin were taken down, Stalingrad was renamed, and Khrushchev announced that he wanted the Soviet people to be happy and would allow greater freedom in the Soviet Union. So how did that work out? Well, an uprising in East Germany was brutally suppressed, a revolution in Hungary was brutally suppressed, and demonstrations in Poland were brutally suppressed. Although he did finally allow some mild reforms. Back in the Soviet Union, he permitted more cultural expression, but then began banning stuff based on his own personal taste. Modern art looks like a child urinated on a canvas. Banned. Jazz music sounds like the feeling of needing to fart. Banned. Your poetry is really depressing. How could anyone in the Soviet Union be depressed? You're banned. Khrushchev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but not like that, or that, or that. Young people began enjoying abhorrent Western pop culture. Son, remove that disgusting imperialist apparel at once. Shut up, Dad. You can't tell me what to do. Well, would you look at that? Turns out he can tell me what to do. The West had initially liked the cut of Khrushchev's jib, but world events soon soured relations even more. The two sides were spying on each other a whole lot throughout the Cold War. The KGB had spies and informants in nearly every aspect of Western life and government, so much so that whenever the US tried to send spies into the Soviet Union, the KGB were usually ready to arrest them on the spot. Members of the Manhattan Project aided the Soviet Union in acquiring the bomb. Some American officials believed they were on the wrong side. I'll sell you 3 secrets for $5 million. Okay. Go ahead. The Allies are digging a tunnel under East Berlin to tap your communications. There's an American agent living at this address in Moscow, and sometimes, when I'm home alone, I like to put on my wife's dresses, sit in the corner, and cry for hours. Very interesting. In America, fear took hold during the Red Scare and the McCarthy trials. American values imploded as fear of communism collided with freedom of thought and expression, and communist kind of became a buzzword thrown around to describe anything people didn't like. Hollywood? Communist. Your next door neighbor's dog? Communist. When the grocery store cashier asks if you need a bag when you clearly can't carry 10 tubs of Baconaise in your hands, communist. But one area in particular where the US had an edge over the Soviet Union was in its espionage technology. In particular, U-2 spy planes flew across Russia carrying out surveillance from the skies. There was a nasty incident in 1960 though, when one was shot down and Khrushchev was furious. Who the hell is this? He's a high-altitude weather enthusiast who flew off course. Okay, that sounds plausible. Wait a minute! Why does he have a gun and a poison needle? Because he's a very naughty high-altitude weather enthusiast. But much to America's concern, the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the space race. Everyone freaked out when Russia launched the world's first satellite, and then they actually sent a man into space. Even worse, there also appeared to be a missile gap in the Soviets' favor, and Khrushchev was so confident that he even allowed the US to set up a technology exhibit in Moscow, attended by a certain Vice President Richard Nixon. Check this out, we have color TV. Yes, but we've been to space and can obliterate you with our massive nuclear arsenal. Check out this vegetable peeler. Tensions increased further when both sides upgraded their atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs. And after West Germany was allowed to join NATO in 1955, Khrushchev set up the defensive Warsaw Pact, strengthening the military ties between the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In 1960, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected John F. Kennedy. The Soviet Union was advancing its technology, but it was also bleeding its coffers dry, and all of the money was going towards the military, not the people. Life under communism was still as hard as ever, and Berlin remained a thorn in the the Soviet side. The contrast between the economically prosperous West and the struggling East was clearer day by day, and East Berliners were still able to freely travel to the West. Now, many of them were deciding to stay there. Millions defected to West Germany via West Berlin, causing Eastern factories to lose workers and taking a heavy toll on the economy. Soviet leaders decided this couldn't continue any longer. First, Khrushchev tried this: leave West Berlin, or else. Or else what? Or else, I'll be really mad at you. Yeah, no, we're gonna stay. Listen, man, West Berlin is ours, East Berlin is yours. That's just how it is. Kennedy felt pretty good about his show of American resolve. But wait a second, did you catch that? Let's replay it.
East Berlin is yours.
Uh-oh, Kennedy just told Khrushchev that the USA wouldn't interfere in what the Soviets did with their section of Berlin, so Khrushchev came up with a new idea. We're gonna build a wall, and it's gonna be a big, beautiful wall, and it's gonna keep out all the Mexicans. That's wrong, it's gonna keep in these Berliners. Oh, sorry, it's gonna keep in all the Mexicans. On August 13th, 1961, Berliners woke up to find their city divided into two, with barbed wire and guards blocking the border between East and West. Over time, a wall was constructed throughout the city. Families were torn apart. Thousands would risk their lives escaping over the wall, and hundreds would die trying. To the despair of Berliners, the West were unable to do anything about it, but the wall did put on full display the failure of the communist system. As Kennedy said, democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. As part of the agreement between the two sides, US diplomats were still allowed to travel to East Berlin, but suddenly, East Berlin crossing guards started giving them the business, and Kennedy was like, nah-uh. In October, the US rolled tanks up to the crossing point at Checkpoint Charlie as a show of strength. The Soviets did the same, and the two were in a standoff. They stayed like that for 16 hours, and the world braced for nuclear Armageddon. Thankfully though, Kennedy called Khrushchev directly and was like, hey man, this is getting way too hot. How about you back your tanks up by an inch and we'll do the same? Sounds good. Okay, how about you back your tanks up by another inch and we'll follow suit? Alright, hey, you want to do another inch? And they both very slowly inched away from the apocalypse. Phew, let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. It wasn't.
All right, so I mean, obviously there are a lot of things that are going to come out. We'll talk about oversimplified part 2. The video actually kind of went over all the stuff I really kind of talked about before I remembered to hit record, which was talking about the end of World War II and, you know, the Soviet Union being communist and China becoming communist and what the Cold War was and the Iron Curtain and the Marshall Plan. Like all the stuff I kind of already talked about, the video also covered. So that was good. It is. It's very, very oversimplified. That's what it means, just so that you get like the point, right? Okay. All right. So let's go back to our course arc. So when they're talking about Kennedy, they're talking, yeah, it's like the gist of it, right? The big broad strokes. So the idea with Kennedy is a lot of things happened during Kennedy's presidency. We had the whole Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs. And, you know, we were like this close to going to actual, like, look like nuclear war with the United States and the Soviet Union. And then, you know, starting with Kennedy's presidency, we got into the Vietnam War, which is what we're about to talk about in our course arc. And of course, he would be assassinated, and we would still be in the Vietnam War for a few years following his assassination. Okay. All right. So the events of Vietnam are what happens when a Cold War heats up. The war in Vietnam had simmered for nearly 25 years. Remember, we're talking about communism and the spread of communism. And so now you have communism in the northern part and people who did not want communism in the southern part. What you need to know is Vietnam was a civil war within their own country. France had already been a part of it. We really should not have gotten involved in it, other than the fact that the South Vietnamese did not want to be communist. And so, because remember, our whole idea, if we're going to help anybody who doesn't want to be communist, we decided to get involved. The thing with Vietnam that you have to understand is that the Viet Cong, the Northern Vietnamese, were absolutely ruthless. and they knew their country. And they were able to, you know, build tunnels and use their tunnels to get through and take out many, many South Vietnamese. And then the other issue that you need to understand is, like, Southern and Northern Vietnamese, they all look the same, right? So we really should not have been involved in that. So we're going to do the quick Moby video, and then we'll talk about the questions. Okay.
Dear Tim and Moby, the Vietnam War confuses me. What was it all about? From Ginny. That's a tough one. Let's start with the basics. Vietnam is a country in Southeast Asia. In the 1800s, France took over control of Vietnam for its valuable exports, rice and rubber. Its neighbors, Laos and Cambodia, were also colonized by the French. Together, the three formed a single colony called French Indochina. The people of Vietnam didn't exactly appreciate being colonized. A lot of farmers lost their land and grew poor, while the French colonists grew rich. During World War II, a Vietnamese man named Ho Chi Minh started organizing his Viet Minh armies against their French rulers. Then, in 1946, war broke out between the Viet Minh and the French. America's president, Harry S. Truman, decided to help France. Well, it's complicated. At the time, the U.S. was involved in the Cold War with communist countries like the Soviet Union and China. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and that worried Truman. See, American lawmakers believed that if Vietnam became communist, the rest of Asia would too. It was called the domino theory. At first, the U.S. gave the French money to help them win the war. But it didn't matter. The Viet Minh won victories in the north of the country. In 1954, France and the Viet Minh signed a treaty dividing the country into communist North Vietnam and anti-communist South Vietnam. The government in the South wasn't very popular with its people. So the North Vietnamese used a transportation system called the Ho Chi Minh Trail to send soldiers and supplies to the communist uprising in the South. But the U.S. supported the South's anti-communist government with money and advisors. Then, on August 2, 1964, North Vietnamese boats fired torpedoes on an American ship patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Lyndon Johnson got Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It said the U.S. could use military force in Vietnam. At first, the force was limited to bombings. But by the end of 1965, there were 184,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, and over 500,000 by the end of 1968. At first, everyone thought it would be an easy fight for the Americans. Their army was much more advanced and included a great navy and air force. Not only that, but a lot of battles were fought in the dense jungle. The U.S. Army was not equipped to fight this kind of war. But the Viet Cong, the communist soldiers in the South, fought a guerrilla war. They used small bands of soldiers to stage ambushes and built huge tunnel complexes to hide in. Even in the cities of the South, where Americans were in control, the Viet Cong would stage suicide bombings and sneak attacks. Back at home, the war became very unpopular. People couldn't understand why Americans had to die for a tiny country halfway around the world. Television, newspapers, and magazines brought home images of innocent Vietnamese civilians killed by American bombs. Protesters marched against the war, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. But a lot of Americans believed in the cause of the war. They thought the protesters were putting U.S. soldiers in danger by weakening support for them. Eventually, President Johnson stopped sending more troops. He even refused to run for another term as president because of Vietnam. Richard Nixon became president in 1968, promising to end the war with honor. But he didn't manage to make the peace until 1973, after his re-election. By the time the war was over, at least 1.2 million North and South Vietnamese were dead, and 58,000 American soldiers died in the conflict. Once the American army pulled out, the North Vietnamese invaded the South and unified the country under communist rule. Today, Vietnam is still mostly communist in its government, although it has shifted to a market economy where businesses and consumers decide what they want to sell and buy. And the U.S. and Vietnam are now friendly with each other. But the Vietnam War divided Americans sharply. After all these years, it can still be a touchy subject to bring up with people who lived through it. Ask your parents what they thought of the war, and read up on it to make up your own mind. Peace.
All right, so let's go through the questions. So who colonized Vietnam in the 1800s? Yep, very good. Which of the following were important exports from Vietnam? Rice and rubber. Good. The idea that if Vietnam fell to communism, then the rest of Asia, there we go, the domino theory, like we talked about. And then when Vietnam was divided, South Vietnam became the communist part of the country. False. South Vietnam was trying to be democratic. Ultimately, though, all of Vietnam is a communist country now. Does everybody have these done? Yeah? All right. All right, so we've talked about how World War II was fought in Europe, but you also need to talk about the fact that there was the Pacific Theater where we fought with Japan during World War II. You have the war between Japan and the U.S. had been simmering for a while. Japan had attacked the U.S. ally China. United States had tried cutting off oil supplies. Ultimately, this would lead to the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And so when we're looking at this page, it just takes us through various time frames of World War II in the Pacific Theater. So you have like the Doolittle raids, which was basically what's known as island hopping. We would use different islands along the way. Instead of trying to go all the way across the Pacific, we would make stops as we went. The Battle of Midway was a naval battle that took place in 1942, initiated by the Japanese in response to Doolittle's air raid of Tokyo. Basically, he thought that it would lure more American aircraft carriers that had been able to escape Pearl Harbor out into open waters, and there they could be attacked more easily, sunk more easily. You have the Battle of Okinawa, which was a month-long both aerial and naval bombardment. After 3 months of severe fighting, Americans finally prevailed. Literally, though, that victory came at 13,000 dead, 37,000 wounded. A third of the island's population had died, which was about 150,000 people. And the entire Japanese garrison was completely wiped out. It was the tenacity of the Japanese forces in the Battle of Okinawa that ultimately convinced President Truman that we needed to drop the atomic bombs rather than continue having more and more loss of life on both sides. So that leads us to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Remember, we talked about this before when we talked about World War II. We dropped we're like, hey, you guys need to give up. We're going to drop a bomb. They said no. Remember the whole kamikaze thought process. So we dropped the first bomb and we're like, you need to give up. They said no. We said we have another bomb. They're like, bring it on. We dropped the second one. And, obliterated yet another Japanese city. We told them, we said, remember, we have many more bombs. We will keep dropping them until basically you're all wiped out. Ultimately, Japan, was like, okay, we give in, which was good because we were absolutely bluffing. All right, so atomic bomb dropped in August 6, 1945. Which one was that one, guys? You guys tell me, which one was dropped on August 6th? Was it Hiroshima or Nagasaki? Hiroshima, good. U.S. lost 33 ships and nearly 350 were damaged there. And guess what? We are done for the day, everybody. So tomorrow is small group meets in the afternoon from 12:30 to 2:30. Don't forget, I will see you tomorrow afternoon. It's Pearl Harbor, yeah. So I will send out a remind text. There will be an announcement, and then I will see you on Wednesday. Bye, everybody.
Like today's Wednesday.
I mean, not Wednesday. I'll see you tomorrow. Sorry, not small group
Yeah.
meets. I'm thinking it was Monday. Yeah, no, I will see you guys tomorrow in class. Bye, everybody.